Hi, welcome to What the Forensics Wednesday. I'm your host, Bridget Brosnahan, retired law enforcement and crime scene detective. What I want to talk to you about today and invite you underneath the crime scene tape of a hit and run accident where the tiniest piece of evidence can end up being your biggest piece of evidence. In 2011, there was a hit and run case involving the death of an 18-month-old boy. When we arrived on scene, there was very little evidence, physical evidence, to assist us in kind of which direction to go as far as the offending vehicle. There was, in fact, one item that officers came upon lying in the street, and at the time, we just didn't know if it was part of that investigation or just a piece of debris on the street. We worked in a city, and oftentimes the streets weren't that clean. So it would not be unheard of to find just a random car part somewhere on the street. So when I arrive, I have an officer come up to me and show me this piece of car part that was a license plate mount. And not knowing whether or not it was part of this case or not, we have to kind of document it. And so we always have to be careful about going down rabbit holes in any investigation. But when you're dealing with a hit and run and the offending vehicle is nowhere to be found and you don't have great evidence to know what the vehicle was, what color it was, who was driving it can be really, really difficult to solve those cases with no physical evidence and very limited eyewitness testimony on a dark street. So I started to document my scene, and the detectives who were working the investigative part of the case decided that let's start with this one piece of motor vehicle, this license plate mount. Let's just start there. There was no other place to start. So they did some research and gathered some information about this license plate mount. And what they discovered was that the plate mount was from a Mercedes, and the rear side of the plate mount had a date on it. So they were able to go to the Mercedes dealership, talk to the guys at the dealership about this item that was found at the scene and get some information, which ended up being a starting point. So it can be frustrating to not have a lot of information to go on when you begin your investigation, and rabbit holes can be definitely frustrating. But you need a starting place. So they started there. And what they discover is that this license plate mount was, in fact, a Mercedes mount from the early 2000s. So it kind of confirmed some of our worries that maybe it was an aftermarket piece and we wouldn't be able to get very far with it. But the information they received was really valuable in the license plate mount. So they began to put boots on the ground. This is one of my favorite investigations because it was good old fashioned boots on the ground police work. And they decided to find out who in Connecticut was driving a blue Mercedes that was from the early 2000s, and came up with a giant list of people all over the state. And they started going door to door, knocking on doors. And they got to a door in Bridgeport, Connecticut that changed everything. So forensically, at that point, by the time that had kind of taken place, I had processed the victim's car. So the car that the baby was riding in was also going to be a very valuable piece of evidence because we know both of those cars came in contact with each other. And when two things come in contact, we know that there is a transfer of one material onto the other material and vice versa. So a motor vehicle that's hit by an offending car obviously could contain some really valuable evidence. So it was my job to look at that car and take paint samples from that car. And when you take paint samples, you're taking samples of the deepest layer. So you're digging into the body of the car down to the metal in where there's no paint. And you're collecting a sample of the layers, the multiple layers of paint that are on the car. They're very, very thin layers. And you have to take multiple samples from different areas on the car and then find areas where the car was impacted by the offending vehicle and take samples from there. So the collection of paint samples off the car is a lengthy process and has to be done very, very carefully as to making sure you're getting deep enough into the paint in order to collect a full solid sample. So that was my job as detectives were trying to figure out who was driving this Mercedes. So we find ourselves going to another state. It brought me to Florida. It brought a couple of us to Florida, where through really, really good detective work, we located a vehicle with the help of a Florida agency and went to Florida, and I processed that vehicle. And the same thing that I did to the victim's car, I had to do to what we believed was the suspect's car at that point. I had to collect samples. I needed to collect samples of different areas on the car, again, ensuring that I had full, solid samples of all the layers of paint on the car. And then in any damaged areas on the offending vehicle, collect samples because, again, there may be paint transfer from the victim's car onto the offending car, what we believed was the offending car. And that is the linkage that we talk about when we're talking about science linking two things together. In this particular case, two cars together involving the death of a baby. And so I continued to work for many, many hours down in Florida collecting samples from this motor vehicle. And all the samples that I collected were sent to the Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory for testing and analysis. The analysis that was done on the paint that was on the victim's vehicle and compared to the samples that I took from what we believed was the offending vehicle came back as being consistent with. In other words, the phrase consistent with is indicating that there were no obvious significant differences in the paint and that there was more of a high likelihood and higher percentage of there being consistency in the two pieces of paint that were looked at, um, which to us meant everything because we had our vehicle. We had the vehicle that hit the baby and took off, and we were able to get justice for that little boy that was killed and for the family. And sometimes the tiniest piece of evidence ends up being your biggest piece of evidence. And that, my friends, is what the Forensics Wednesday. Stay tuned for more. Like, share, follow to get more inside, raw, real, under the tape information right here.